Hello and good morning, everybody. It's me, Julian. So, yesterday's Monday morning lecture was unfortunately accidentally deleted because of a glitch. We've been having a lot of glitches on YouTube recently. So, I thought instead I would record another mini lecture, a 10-minute video, which I'm going to title The Scandal of Psychoanalysis, which is both a reference to Slavoj Žižek's argument that Lacanian psychoanalysis presents itself as scandalous, but also a tacit reference, if you will, to the Church Latin scandalus, which means a stumbling block. Psychoanalysis is and remains a stumbling block within the history of philosophy, or if you will, anti-philosophy. And yet, nevertheless, this is a fruitful encounter, an event within human thought, to put it in Budgian terms. And so what I'm going to try to do here is give you some easy and hopefully accessible basic arguments about why psychoanalysis still matters today and why I think we should argue for a return to it. I would also like to recommend a little book to you that I recently encountered titled Jacques Lacan, Past and Present, a Dialogue with Alain Badiou and Elisabeth Rudinesco, which is quite interesting and can serve as an introduction of sorts to at least set the scene by which to understand Lacanian psychoanalysis. I should also say that my own ebook has just come out. It's titled The Four Masters, and it's an introduction to the concept of the master in relationship to Lacanian psychoanalysis, and specifically Žižek's use of said concept. And if you're curious, the four masters are the obscene master, the pseudo-master, the perverse master, and the authentic master. And in my ebook, you have an easy and accessible introduction to those concepts, which you can find exclusively on Patreon. But let us begin. What exactly makes Lacanian psychoanalysis a scandal? Well, there's a couple of ways to approach this. You could say in a metaphysical, philosophical sense, it is a scandal. You could say in terms of psychology and its relationship to psychology, it presents a scandal. But perhaps the most scandalous part of Lacanian psychoanalysis is the figure of Lacan himself, who quite readily embraces the figure of the master, even the pseudo-master, the maître. Lacan seduces, he speaks theatrically, he often communicates in seeming banalities or platitudes in his lectures, at least those that we have from him. Which is to say, Lacan presented himself as a figure who demanded fidelity and love, who essentially said, I am speaking to you because you are one of my acolytes. You are one of the in-group. And towards the later stage of his life, he started to unravel this mystique. And yet even in this dissolution of his mastery, he remained nevertheless the figure of the master. And in a sense, this is because Lacanian psychoanalysis sought to radicalize and indeed transform the relationship of the psychoanalyst to the psychoanalysand, which is to say, the process of transference that exists within Lacanian psychoanalysis was rendered into a much more dramatic position, similar to the Socratic method, in which we have a figure, the master, who guides the interlocutor on an adventure of sorts. And it's important to note here that Lacan was deeply suspicious, even hostile to, clinical psychology, and indeed any attempt to render Freudian psychoanalysis into another scientism, which is to say, he rejected so-called vulgar materialism, the idea that we could simply study the patterns of the brain, or even that we could treat patients as if they were simply problems to be solved. Instead, the Lacanian maxim, which is well known, which is that one must practice fidelity to one's desire, here had to be taken quite literally. The task, or the goal, if you will, of Lacanian psychoanalysis is not to cure the patient, not even in the Freudian sense, but instead to instruct the patient as to how to take control of their desires, how indeed to become the master of it. The scandal of Lacanian psychoanalysis in relationship to the figure of the master is therefore that Lacan readily assumes the role of pseudo-master so as ultimately to teach or instruct the subject that they are already free, that they are already their own master, that they do not need one. In this sense, Lacanian psychoanalysis disabuses the patient of their very desire for someone to tell them how to live. This is the original scandal of psychoanalysis. It's not any formal innovation apropos clinical psychology or even Freudian psychoanalysis, but the extent to which Lacan embodies and indeed embraces the illusionary role of the master figure, thereby essentially embracing himself as a pseudo-master, someone who teaches you how to live. Now, I'd like to also briefly introduce the secondary scandals of psychoanalysis. The first one I have to place in a philosophical context of the 1960s in post-war France. Lacan essentially was combining two metaphysical attitudes, philosophical attitudes, that were seemingly irreconcilable. On the one hand, we have the trend of structuralism, which we see both in terms of Levi-Straussian philosophy or linguistics, as well as in even the work of Foucault and Merleau-Ponty, phenomenology, etc. And Lacan took these ideas and he merged them with what seemed antithetical to it, which was Sartrean existentialism, Heideggerian philosophical idealism. And it's important to note here that structuralism is really suspicious of the idea of the subject. The whole point is to deconstruct, if you will, the subject. Lacan despised Derrida, by the way, so I use this word with caution. The whole point was to essentially look at the formal structures by which language conditions, indeed structures, the subject as such. Thereby, the subject becomes to some extent illusionary. This is something we see in Foucault. The subject is the subject of power and discourse, but also within Levi-Strauss and even phenomenology. Phenomenology perhaps comes the closest to the problem of perception and how the world is perceived by the subject. Whereas Sartrean existentialism essentially says that we can have Marxism without Marx. We can return to a more, if you will, Nietzschean or Kierkegaardian idea of the self and the will to power and self-creation. In other words, Sartrean existentialism focuses very strongly on the idea of subjectivity as such. It doesn't render it suspicious, it actually emphasizes it. And Lacan accomplished something that was quite radical at the time, which was to take the principles of structuralism, the subject of the unconscious, etc., the subject is structured like a language, is Lacan's main structuralist principle here, and to combine it with a radical return to subjectivity, which for him is a return to Freud, a return to psychoanalysis. In other words, he fuses the existential philosophical idealist approach to the self-transparent subject, indeed what one might even call the Cartesian cogito, the ideal of the subject which knows itself, which would be a scandal to any structuralist approach to philosophy or linguistics as such. And he combines these two, which at the time is considered scandalous. Finally, we have to place Lacan in his historical context when it came to his aversion to both scientism and obscurantism, which is to say, Lacan argued that scientism, when taken to its logical extreme, became not only a vulgar materialism, but precisely a form of obscurantism, an ideological mode of operating in which all that mattered were facts and supposedly empirically determined values. But he was also critical of obscurantism, of religious mysticism, and all the trendy esotericism that was popular in the 60s and 70s. And instead, Lacan, once again, combines them in a sense, which to say, by his return to Freud, he brings us back to the language of psychoanalysis, but grounds it in a philosophical inquiry that spans all of time. In this sense, Lacan is always interested in philosophy, seen through a psychoanalytic lens, inasmuch as he is interested in psychoanalysis, seen through a philosophical lens. Indeed, his inquiry into Sophocles and Greek tragedy, Antigone, but also Oedipus at Colonos, is deeply informative for his arguments. And that is the original scandal of psychoanalysis, that he embraces the figure of the master, that he goes against structuralism and existentialism and finds a new return to the Freudian subject, the subject of the unconscious. And the lesson of psychoanalysis is therefore is that we need it precisely in times that are confusing and overwhelming, that fuse different attitudes towards what happens and provides us with a new critical perspective. I would also encourage you to consider purchasing my ebook on Patreon. Thank you so much. See you soon.